the honourable member for Calgary Nose Hill.
Mr. Speaker. I've noticed that Beethoven's Seventh Symphony, the second movement, makes sense to even the most untrained ear. It juxtaposes restraint with passion in its cadence. It's both regimented and whimsied. It's patient and it's aggressive. It's elegant and it's rough. It's beauty, it's art, and it's the perfect balance, and it's everything that we are capable of. We wrote Anna Karenina. We've put men on the moon, we've discovered antibiotics, and we've found the Higgs boson. We are beauty and we are art. And yet, we repeat the well-documented failures of our past. Standing at the Temple Mount last year, what was first and foremost on my mind was not God's peace, but how many lives have been sacrificed over the history of our species in the name of tribalism, religion, and hate. Standing on the Syrian border and then looking into the haunted eyes of Nadia Murad while she described her rape to me, my Western naivety that those who kill in the name of religion can be rationed with or appeased was violently stripped from me. And so here we are today, in the legislative chamber of one of the world's most wealthy, most democratic, most capitalist countries, 2 generations removed from open global conflict, many more generations removed from sustained open conflict within our own borders, many innovations, many works of art, and billions of dollars of created wealth later, that we find ourselves debating us versus them. It is facile for us to believe that there aren't others on this planet who disagree with our way of life. There are those who hold views so extreme that they kill in the name of God. They rape in the name of their God. They subjugate and bring terror in the name of their God. No religion and no nation is immune to this. These people live within our borders and without them. They are Muslim and they are Christian. They are Sikh and they are Hindu. And yet there are those who seek to bring light and beauty to the world. They seek to bring peace, prosperity, and tolerance. Every religion and every nation has these people. They are Muslim and they are Christian. They are Sikh and they are Hindu. Good, courage, innovation, creativity, tolerance, love, light, and hope know no boundaries. Nor does evil, hate, subjugation, intolerance, decadence, and violence. So what are we to do? We who value equality of opportunity, we who have created art and beauty and Ebola vaccines and nanotechnology, we who value hope and the greater good, we who value knowledge, we who value love, we as Canadians. My entreaty to my colleagues tonight is this, that we reject facile arguments designed to sell products and people, and in doing so value logic and compassion as we set about our legislative responsibilities in the matter of immigration policy to Canada. I'm fairly sure nobody in this place is going to be pleased with me for this speech tonight. To respond to the immigration policies of other nations, we must first get our own house in order, and then through those actions, show the world what immigration policy best practice looks like. If we are to have any influence on international immigration policy, we must refute through action the emerging international norm of immigration debate becoming firmly entrenched in 2 polarized positions. The first school of thought believes that there should be little debate around how many humanitarian immigrants we should receive in the light of one of the world's most severe migrant crises in recent history. If this belief is questioned, allegations of racism are frequently leveled. The second camp believes that we should also slam the door shut, that they're stealing our jobs and costing us too much in government programming, they're all terrorists, they're different than us, and to think otherwise means that one is a bleeding heart socialist. Both of these positions are puerile. To those who subscribe to the first school of thought, Canadians openly accept immigration to our country with 2 caveats, the first being that our immigration system is sound. Canadians expect our system of checks and balances to be rigorous and to ensure that those who would harm our country or try to enter it under false pretenses are not allowed entrance. In this, the Liberal government's decision to lift our visa restriction on Mexico without the completion of a formal review that ensures the proper processes are in place to prevent high levels of bogus refugee claims was poor policy. Questioning if our immigration processes are adequately functional does not make someone a racist, nor does it mean that we don't want a positive relationship with a country such as Mexico. It reflects the fact that prior to the visa restriction being imposed, Canada saw thousands of false refugee claims from this country and had security concerns regarding Mexican nationals seeking to enter Canada. A formal review would ask for our immigration officials to work with their Mexican counterparts to put processes in place to stop this from happening. It's a positive process, but it takes time. Instead, this government bowed to pressure from various industrial lobbies and lifted the visa. They claimed that increases in Mexican tourism to Canada and trade restrictions that Mexicans would lift in return would outweigh the cost of processing and deporting thousands of false refugee claimants. Indeed, a notion from immigration officials in the Canada Gazette in late 2016 shows that even after these anticipated economic benefits, that the cost to Canadian taxpayers for this decision would be upwards of $250 million. This does not instill confidence in our immigration system, and similarly, when the Liberal government mused about performing security and health vetting on 25,000 Syrian refugees after they arrived in Canada as opposed to before, we voiced opposition. This is because deporting someone after they've claimed refugee status in Canada is a difficult and costly process. This decision would have been unsafe and eroded public confidence in our immigration system. As it stood, even so, this process was reviewed by an American Senate committee. Questioning security screening process is not racist, and it doesn't mean that Canada doesn't want to help. It's a sign of prudence and respect for Canadians. The second caveat for Canadians to accept immigration is that they expect new immigrants to Canada to embrace our pluralism and integrate into our economic and social fabric. This means ensuring that there is adequate government programming for refugees to learn skills like being able to speak one of our official languages so that they don't become isolated and are able to obtain employment. These services cost money and take time to establish, so the government has a responsibility to be transparent to Canadians about these costs and to accordingly set out immigration levels. This is why the government is required to table a report to Parliament every year that outlines the numbers of immigrants that it wants to bring in under both the humanitarian and economic classes. The Liberal government changed the ratio of economic to humanitarian refugees from roughly 70-30 to 50-50. It's not racist of me, after hearing from out-of-work people in my constituency, as well as recent refugees who can't access language training programs, to ask how the government is going to pay for dramatically increased levels of integration programming support. The Liberal government has provided exactly zero public plans on how they plan to help 25,000 Syrian refugees integrate into our economy. Many of these refugees have not found employment. There is no budget for social assistance payments to those who find themselves unemployed after their 1 year of public transition funding runs out. There have been no increased payments to school boards to deal with the special needs of many of these refugee students, and refugees are relying on food banks. Why? Asking these questions doesn't mean that Canada isn't compassionate. It's exactly the opposite. Transparent plans and budgets for these issues are what gives refugees the tools to be successful in Canada, and in turn gives the social license for allowing more refugees in the future. The Liberals, in their hurry to create a quota, have failed in much of this. Also, we should question how we prioritize refugees and whether we should do that based on vulnerability. Canada cannot sustain an unlimited amount of refugees, so we have to set caps and prioritize who we let in. It's not racist to acknowledge that people are refugees because of religious persecution. And while refugees' situations imply that entire populations are at risk, there are subsets that are more vulnerable than others. This is why the Liberal government and the United Nations have abjectly failed refugees from persecuted minority groups, many of whom are genocide victims in Syria and Iraq. Yazidis, Christians, minority Muslim groups, and LGBTI have all suffered atrocities at the hands of extremists and from the religious majority in the region. Indeed, the entire population in the region is at risk and is suffering. However, the fact remains that there are groups that cannot exist in refugee camps because they will be killed because of their religious beliefs. Late last year, 2 UNHCR officials sat in my office and told me that one of the reasons why out of 25,000 refugees, virtually zero Yazidis had been referred to Canada was that because of the time constraints that were placed on them by the Liberal government, it was easier to simply pull the numbers from the religious majority located in refugee camps rather than to actively search out genocide victims. Moreover, the Liberal Party used a game of one-upmanship in the last campaign in terms of numbers of how many Syrian refugees would come into country to whip up whispered claims of racism on the part of our party. The quiet argument was made that we hate Muslim refugees because our immigration minister asked for an audit of how many persecuted ethnic and religious minority groups had been referred to Canada as government-sponsored refugees by the United Nations. While we did this, thousands of Yazidi women were being raped dozens of times a day by dozens of men, all in the name of God. While we did this, genocide was occurring. And while we did this, we forgot compassion in the name of bureaucratic simplicity and political gain. For shame on all of us. We are all to be shamed because this brings me to the second polarized school of thought. As much as religion shouldn't be excluded from the criteria for prioritization of refugees, if we are the enlightened society we purport to be, we shouldn't preclude someone from entering our country solely on the grounds of their religious belief or country of origin. For eons, we have been killing each other based on religion. In Canada, our pluralism is sustained by laws which separate church and state and harshly punish murder, rape, hate speech, and other actions which are often carried out in the name of one God or another. I am a Christian. My closest friends are Jewish, Sikh, and Muslim. We talk about the fact that there are extremists in all of our faiths. For example, those who believe in creating inequality for and persecuting LGBT and women. In Canada, our freedom of religion allows us to believe whatever we want, but it does not afford us the right to act on those beliefs if they are criminal. So in that, completely shutting our doors to new immigrants is wrong. Should we have an open and transparent debate about how many newcomers we welcome to Canada and under what circumstances they enter? Yes. Should we ensure that we are transparent in the costing and availability of integration programming in the context of the strength of our economy? Yes. Should we ensure that our security screening processes for entering Canada are vigorous and strong? Yes. Should we vigorously enforce our laws to ensure that crimes committed in the name of religion are harshly punished? Yes. Should we ask why the Liberal government has shifted the responsibility from privately sponsored refugee program supporters solely onto taxpayer-sponsored programs this year and demand them to change that decision? Yes. Will shutting the doors to immigrants ensure that all religious hate crime in Canada stops and that all Canadians suddenly have jobs overnight? No. The date on my grandmother's record of passage from Slovakia is May 1938. She found safe haven in Canada as a migrant during one of modern history's largest migrant crises. This is top of mind as I speak to you today, 2 short generations later, as Canada's official opposition shadow minister for immigration. Some of our greatest shames in our nation's history occurred when we failed to show compassion to those in need. The MS St. Louis and the Komagata-Maru come to mind. Canada is a nation filled with those who have been persecuted and have worked to build a country that is a beacon of light and the capacity of humanity to do what is good, just, and beautiful. Completely shutting our doors to people based on religion is the antithesis of this. Many owners of job-creating companies, investors, innovators, and artists are newcomers to Canada. Closing our doors to those people with the thought that it will lower unemployment levels is a fallacy. During the last election campaign, my party announced a policy that would create the tip line to report, quote, barbaric cultural practices. If we were truly concerned about the rights of women in the situations that this tip line purportedly designed to prevent, then why did we present it wrapped in an us versus them message? Why would we cave to the allure of the same dog whistle politics that everyone else was, and in doing so, make things worse for the isolated and inflaming and normalizing allegations of racism? And today, there are those who purport to share my party affiliation that blur the discussion of fair criticism of the integration of our immigration system by politicizing a mass murder at a mosque and presenting undefined policy that could be interpreted that entry into Canada is dependent upon one's willingness to take a bite of a ham sandwich. This is better than the Prime Minister's tweet. Is this better than the Prime Minister's tweet stating that Canada is open to refugees after steadfastly refusing to protect victims of genocide through military intervention or, at a minimum, prioritizing the resettlement of genocide victims? No. We are all complicit. Reading and watching the Western world's response to the atrocities that have occurred in Syria have confirmed serious, broad systemic failures that make me question if never again is really anything more than a platitude. Do we actually have the capacity to respond to the breakdown of humanity, and under what circumstances do we care if it does? On this front, contemporary students of history often tisk-tisk when confronted with times that the ruling class became grossly disconnected with the proletariat. And broadly speaking, modern Westerners are smug that this let-them-eat-cake-style decadence couldn't befall us. Yet our system of capitalism and democratic institutions have given way to global prosperity and sustained peace. 2 generations removed from global conflict, this is today's foolish immutable certainty. After this year, I wonder if this has grown into an entitlement. With increasing frequency, we let our values become someone else's problem if we care at all. Nobody wants to do that job. No worries. There's a temporary foreign worker for that. Want to shut down extractive industries in Canada but enjoy the same quality of opportunity? Those with dirty jobs can just transition into something else. In the meantime, the government will borrow and spend to keep us afloat, and we can depend on it instead of ourselves. After all, it's just cheap to borrow money right now, isn't it? Besides, we can always cut military spending because peace comes without cost and war doesn't happen to us. There's been perhaps no greater indictment of the rise of Western decadence than our response to the Syrian conflict. Between trying to appease unappeasable foes, the woeful response to the migrant crisis, racist versus socialist, instead of searching for pragmatism, and explaining away the issue of the quagmire that we shouldn't get involved in, or we were the ones that caused the problem, so let's just stay out of it and hope that fixes it. In the last 5 years, hundreds of thousands of humans have been slaughtered and displaced. Women's rights, minority rights, and human rights in general have been violated. Genocide has occurred. It's also become taboo to question the efficacy of the institutions that we have put in place to prevent these things. The UN has been toothless in its approach to many things, but its failures to Syrians and the Yazidi genocide victims should light the world on fire in terms of its desire to see its functionalities. Instead, its actors are fiddling with the politics who gets a seat on its Security Council while Aleppo burns. With great irony, this has all happened while we have become globally interconnected. Aleppo is no longer somewhere else, it's live on your Twitter feed, yet we treat these images, videos of slaughter of our fellow humans, as akin to some sort of third-player video game. That's if we bother to consider them at all. The reality is that the West does not have the luxury of assuming that this crisis in Syria doesn't affect us. It has shown us that those that don't share the institutions of democracy and free markets that sustain our peace, that we have forgotten that power is taken, it's not given. Across governments and political flavor, we now believe that we are entitled to our peace. We also believe that our Western brand of blind ideological extremism can solve problems when it's mostly gridlocked us into an echo chamber. This translates into foreign policy that has a key objective of being unobjectionable and utilizes the assumption that religious extremists and rogue despots can be bought or appeased into submission. Moreover, it's shown the world that we can't be bothered when humanity and civilization completely disintegrates because, hey, it's not happening to us. If we don't find a way to challenge the status quo of polarized political dogma, our selective antipathy to the human condition, and the abject failure of our Western political institutions to prevent atrocities, future generations will likely be tisking us too. And that assumes that in our selfish decadence, we've left them any sort of society that has the capacity to do so. Each of us need to be ashamed of how our political motivations, our selfishness, our decadence, and our political gamemanship has left us to this place of polarized debate that we are in today. Our only redemption can be found in an ask for forgiveness and an understanding that global peace comes with a cost that is not just borne by our military. As much as we may seek to fling our doors wide open to refugees, we cannot ignore the thought of those who seek to destroy our way of life, and we cannot turn a blind eye when it comes to protecting those in the region who share our ideals from annihilation. This comes with initiatives that create global economic prosperity and sustainability, the costs of which are borne by those of us who find ourselves with the fortune of living in countries of great pluralism. So how can Canada be a leader in pluralism policy best practice? Let's ensure that the debate within our own nation pulls beyond two unproductive polarized fallacies, protects the safety of Canadians, grows our economy, and shows the compassion of our people. Let's support free trade and support those who support the rights of marginalized and refugees around the world. If we cannot do better and we only seek to politicize situations of great gravity, then we are doomed to repeat the sins of our past. And in closing, I hope that none of us here will resign ourselves to be complicit. Instead, let us find guidance in our capacity to create beauty and art. And in doing so, we advance our cause forward because of our humanity, not because of our political strife.
Questions and comments? The member for Ottawa South.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to my colleague across for a thoughtful speech. I think most members here this evening would share in some of the noble ideals that she has projected through the words she's put forward tonight on the floor. I think that she's used some powerful language around polarized ideals, polarized fallacies, polarized political dogma, political gamesmanships, whisper campaigns, and so on and so forth. There's a slight revision in history in terms of some of the facts as she's presented them in terms of what our government is or is not doing in terms of changing our immigration system. However, I do want to ask her a pointed question, and I want to do it in a non-partisan way, and it's an opportunity for her to answer a question which many Canadians are asking themselves today about her own party. And I want to come back to the tip line that she mentioned, which many Canadians describe not as a tip line but as a snitch line. She projected it and put it forward this evening as some kind of protective mechanism for women. I'd like to give her a chance to explain what that means. And I'd also like her to explain what her party's position is as it permits the debate, which is taking place in her leadership campaign, led by the Member of Parliament from Simcoe Grey, who would like to impose a values test on immigrants who are seeking to enter our country.
The honourable member for Calgary Nose Hill.
I don't think that the member opposite listened to a word I said, but I will say this. The country is watching this debate tonight and asking us how we are to respond to the executive order in the United States, and my entreaty is this. Rather than sending out tweets saying, welcome refugees, in 140 characters, let's actually welcome some Yazidi genocide victim survivors. As many of my colleagues in this place have asked for tonight, let's lift the cap on privately sponsored refugee families. There's 45,000 applications in the queue. Let's unleash the generosity of Canadians and not just to shift the responsibility of this to Canadian taxpayers. Let's make sure that when we are welcoming refugees to Canada, the metrics that the government isn't using isn't just numbers. It's saying how many people have found jobs, how many women who have come here with children aren't isolated in their homes and have learnt one of Canada's first languages. These are the sorts of things that the government has completely let go in their rhetoric over the last 18 months. Now, the point I was trying to make tonight is that there isn't a single one of us that is not complicit in the rise of rhetoric around the immigration debate in the last 18 months. From colleagues in the European Union, the rise of nationalist parties, Brexit, what's happened in the United States, we are not making sense on this debate. The question my colleague asked tonight was the complete opposite of what I was trying to do in my speech. I don't understand why we can't just focus on how we're delivering services and policies and instead trying to use immigration policy and human lives to sell political rhetoric.
Questions and comments. Honourable member for Churchill River, Kiewit-McAskey.
Mr. Speaker, there's no question that tonight we're gathering in very dark times, both in the U.S., but also given the recent tragedy where Muslims, Canadians were killed here in our own country. Speaks of that same darkness here at home. But in that darkness, and certainly we see it here tonight, there is hope. And I want to put on the record that that hope is in the galleries, where so many people, many of whom are young, are here to stand up and demand better from their government. And I do say that, Speaker, because I know some of the people in that gallery, and these are people that want a government that is going to denounce the racist policies of Donald Trump. And these are also people that stand up for the rights of refugees and immigrants and that demand more from their government. And I want to register that I'm very proud of my generation and the people that are here tonight and those that are watching online and on TV that are saying that, no, we're not just going to sit by. We are going to be active. We are going to be active on the streets, in rallies, in vigils. We are going to be out there. And we are demanding better from our government. And so my question to my colleague is, does she agree that many Canadians and many young Canadians are expecting not just some nice-sounding words in a tweet, but are demanding action that truly supports refugees and immigrants, that truly stands up against discrimination and Islamophobia, and essentially a message that Canadians are demanding that their government truly stand up for them? Thank you.
Member for Calgary Nose Hill.
Well, Mr. Speaker, actions always speak louder than words, and we are measured by our actions. So here tonight, I hope that what members of the government party might leave with, what members of the Citizenship and Immigration Department who are sitting in the lobby tonight might leave with, what the Immigration Minister might leave here tonight with, is the fact that the next time the Prime Minister feels compelled to tweet about an American policy decision, we should first look inwardly and ensure that we have our own house in order. There are several pieces of policy that can show the world in a nonpartisan perspective what Canada means in terms of welcoming refugees. Ensuring that genocide survivors have a home here in a short period of time, per the dictates of a unanimously passed motion in this place. Ensuring that refugees that are in this country that are government-sponsored have the programs and services that they need to integrate into the Canadian economy and our social fabric in a short period of time, in a plan that is transparently costed and presented to the Canadian public so that there can be social license gained. And through programs such as the privately sponsored refugee program, I have no idea why the government put a cap on that this year.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Social Development.
Thank you very much. I listened intently to the speech for the member for Calgary-Nose Hill, and my question is this. The extraordinary measures taken by this government to land 40,000 Syrian refugees into this country in the last year had an impact on countries in other parts of the world where refugees are also in desperate need of support. In fact, if you go to the Amnesty International list and look at the top 10 countries generating refugees, you'll find Afghanistan, Somalia, Sudan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Myanmar, the Central African Republic, Eritrea. Despite the fact that the member opposite asked us to slow down and increase security, despite the fact that the member opposite was part of a government that cut services to refugees, cut public housing, and cut services around language training to immigrants and refugees over the last 10 years, the question is a very simple one. If we have an obligation to refugees, we have an obligation all over the world, not just one particular country or one particular population. And if genocide is wrong, it's wrong everywhere. How do we clear the backlog created by the extraordinary effort to land 40,000 Syrians and balance that against the need to also respond to the refugee crisis right around the world in the countries I listed if we don't have a balanced approach that shares the burden of all countries and allows all countries access to to our shores in order that they get refuge?
For Calgary-Nose Hill.
Mr. Speaker, in June 2015, the United Nations issued a report which called upon the international community to accelerate the asylum claims of Yazidi victims of genocide. Why? Why did the United Nations say prioritize these refugee claimants before anyone else? Because there are people that are being wiped off the face of this earth. There are people who cannot make it into the UN's referral process because, first of all, to get to a refugee camp is near to impossible, and then when they arrive there, they can't stay there for appointment processes because they're persecuted when they get there. This is well-documented fact. There are so many people in the world who require the assistance of a generous country like Canada. That said, we shouldn't just rely on the bureaucracy of a UN when we clearly see failures. So for me, I think the response has to be twofold. When we see genocide occurring, we first of all have to call it for what it is, which this government did not do. This government had several opportunities to vote to support the declaration of the Yazidi genocide, and they failed to do it. The member opposite voted against that. And then we need to ensure that our processes to prioritize those victims reflect such declarations. Thank you.
We have time for a short question. The Honourable Opposition House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank my colleague for her speech. She's not only my colleague, but my friend, and I was very, very proud of that very well thought and very, very well spoken speech from her heart. I want to just, I guess, talk about something that I think is hopeful, and I think about the people in my riding who have welcomed as private sponsors so many refugees in the last year. And these are individuals who they probably don't march, and they probably aren't here in the gallery today, but they literally open up their home and they house people and they help them learn English. They've helped them get jobs, and it has been a huge success in southern Manitoba. We brought multitudes of refugees under the private sponsorship program. Can my colleague talk about how successful that is and how we can encourage that and find a win-win for everyone?
We have time for a brief response.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The private sponsorship program for refugees is a hallmark of Canadian refugee or immigration policy. It allows individual Canadian citizens to raise funds, come together as groups, and to bring people to this country and support them through their integration into our economic and social fabric. It's actually international best practice, and many of the refugees that came into Canada late in 2015 that the Prime Minister took pictures with at the Pearson International Airport were actually brought in through the generosity of private sponsors. So tonight, as we look towards ways of welcoming more refugees to Canada, we know that this is best practice. We demand, my party calls upon the government to lift this ban on privately sponsored refugees and to ensure that when the government is taking photo ops, that they're thanking the generosity of Canadians who raise the funds to bring